Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Saya Zulfitri Yusof. Ini adalah buletin Awani khas DCC World Economic Forum WEF 2022 yang bakal melangsung ataupun melabuhkan tirainya hari ini, di mana Forum Ekonomi Dunia WEF 2022 yang berlangsung di Davos hari ini akan menamatkan sesinya, dan antara sesi yang terakhir sebentar lagi, sekarang ini 4.30 di Malaysia, sekitar 11.30 pagi di Davos, adalah sesi yang akan berlangsung berjudul Society and Equity Global Risks in an Era of Turbulence, di mana sesi ini akan disertai oleh Menteri Keuangan Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Abdul Aziz, di mana anda dapat saksikan sesi ini di astroawani.com sebentar lagi, dan juga di Awani sekarang saluran 501 pada jam 4.45 petang. Jadi ini eksklusif kami bawakan pada petang ini. Tapi sebelum kita menghadiri secara virtualnya sesi ini, saya ingin bersama dengan rakan-rakan saya, dua wakil Astro Awani di Pergunungan Davos itu, iaitu Ketua Pengarang Astro Awani Ashwat Ismail yang kini berada di Dewan Kongres di tempat berlangsungnya sesi itu, dan juga rakan saya Najib Aruf juga bersedia bersama dengan kita pada jam ini. Saya akan bersama dengan Ashwat dulu. Ashwat, WEF 2022 setelah 2 tahun tidak diadakan, sudah pasti ini ditunggu. Persoalan dan juga krisis yang berlaku dalam dunia ini seperti tidak terbendung untuk ditanggung ataupun difikirkan secara bersama. Namun selepas 2-3 hari di Davos, adakah bual bicara, perbincangan itu dapat memberikan solusi kepada permasalahan dunia pada hari ini, ataupun terlampau besar perkara itu untuk dihadapi?
Dia adalah satu perkara yang sangat kiranya tiada komitmen secara bersama, utamanya melibatkan negara-negara, kesenjangan yang berlaku antara negara-negara maju, negara-negara sedang membangun dan negara yang berpendapatan rendah. Itu antara cabaran utama yang kita perhatikan antara diskusi yang telah berlangsung sepanjang WEF ini, sepanjang World Economic Forum ini. Tetapi perkara yang menjadi pokok, oleh sebab itu kita lihat sesi yang dia akan disertai oleh Menteri Keuangan Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul antara lain akan menyentuh tentang global risk. Risiko global ini kita tidak boleh lari. Apa yang sedang berlaku dan kita hadapi di Malaysia ketika ini, dekat B40 dan risiko yang bakal berlaku sekiranya makanan kita meningkat lebih 4% lebih 3-4 bulan, itu akan memberikan kesan dan protection para pakar ekonomi tersebut. Dan itu dibincangkan pada ketika ini. Dan dia memberi impak yang besar bagaimana global risk dapat mengurangkan impak risiko ni apabila dihentak dengan krisis inflasi dan dihentak juga dengan krisis inflasi makanan. Itu yang meningkatkan, utamanya sekaligus dia memberi kesan kepada kos sara hidup yang akan menjadi krisis kos sara hidup, utamanya dalam kalangan negara-negara sedang membangun dan negara-negara berpendapatan rendah. Itu Najib Aruf, memang editor Niaga Awani, memang turun ke lapangan dan bercakap mengenai isu ini. Tetapi penyelesaian yang tuntas tidak ada. Dia tidak boleh zero summing situasi atau tapi kena ada mixture of both. Itu antara pakar-pakar bercakap hybrid sikit lah. Maknanya ada pendekatan yang bakal dilakukan seperti kupon sistem kupon contohnya satu, dan juga cash handout juga diperlukan. Mungkin dapat mencari jalan tengah untuk menghubungkan dua perkara ini kerana gap is too wide, jurang itu begitu luas.
Najib, dapat saya tanyakan kepada Najib juga, kerana apa yang berlaku di Malaysia tidak terasing dengan apa yang berlaku di peringkat global. Kalau sekitar awal tahun ini apabila perang Ukraine dan juga Rusia berlaku, kita tidak merasakan impaknya. Tapi hari ini seluruh dunia merasakan impak rantaian bekalan itu. Dan ini ialah dunia yang berlaku. Inilah ekosistem dunia sejak pandemik COVID-19. Tidak ada yang terkecuali. Justru bagaimana sebenarnya bagi Najib secara pribadi menghubungkan antara isu di peringkat domestik, di peringkat lokal dengan apa yang dibincangkan di peringkat, orang kata inilah T20 atau top of the top di peringkat perbincangan di Davos ini. Pada pandangan Najib bagaimana?
Okey. Zul, kalau kita melihat betul ini adalah cabaran sejagat, cabaran yang bersifat bersama dan juga Malaysia tidak terkecuali, semua negara tidak terkecuali. Dan kalau kita melihat rantaian bekalan itu memang terjejas disebabkan oleh perang di Ukraine. Sebagai contoh, bekalan gandum, kapal di pelabuhan Ukraine tidak dapat keluar untuk membekalkan gandum. Jadi ini adalah bagaimana permasalahan yang berlaku pada ketika ini. Topik seperti ini diangkat di WEF untuk dibincangkan untuk mencari solusi. Cuma apa yang saya persoalkan sedikit dalam isu perang di Ukraine sebagai contoh, dia agak, kalau boleh saya sifatkan di sini, adalah agak sedikit drama. Kerana apa? Perbincangan ini adalah bersifat sebelah pihak, tidak melibatkan kedua-dua pihak yang bertelagah sebagai contoh. Kerana delegasi Rusia tidak pun hadir di sini pada kali ini. Walhal sebelum ini adalah antara delegasi yang besar. Billionaire mereka hadir, menyawarkan dan sebagainya. Saya semalam bercakap dengan jurukamera kami, Rizal Rahim. Saya mengatakan bahawa isu Ukraine ini yang dibawa di sini, umpama mereka ni hanya mengumpat je lah di sini. Tidak ada solution yang boleh dinyatakan kerana tidak ada pihak yang terlibat pun yang hadir di sini. Hanya Volodymyr Zelensky yang berucap melalui secara maya. Dan pada akhirnya, bagaimana solusi ini dapat diselesaikan secara tuntas, kerana kesannya kita juga rasai di Malaysia. Harga barang naik disebabkan oleh gangguan rantaian bekalan, ditambah pula dengan sikap negara India yang tidak mahu mengeksport gandum disebabkan oleh perang dan sebagainya. Ini adalah sikap dan juga yang membawa kepada deglobalization. Ini juga disentuh di WF, penting. Cuma apabila saya bertanyakan kepada pakar, bagaimana deglobalisasi ini mampulah kita selesaikan di pentas WF sebagai contoh. Betul apa Ashok katakan, tidak ada jawapan tuntas kepada permasalahan ini. Saya kira ia masih lagi di peringkat awal. Perang pun baru masuk bulan keempat. Bukanlah kita meminta masa yang panjang, tidak. Tapi setidaknya ia memerlukan 2-3 sesi dialog lagi untuk melihat kemahuan politik itu mungkin boleh wujud di peringkat kerajaan, korporat dan juga semua pihak yang terlibat, bahkan masyarakat sivil juga, Zul.
Ashwat, sesi sebentar lagi yang akan disertai oleh Menteri Keuangan Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul. Ini adalah sesi yang saya rasa cukup menarik sekali kerana selain daripada tajuk dan juga topik yang akan dibawakan ialah speaker yang turut akan bersama dengan Tengku Zafrul nanti. Antaranya ada Helen Clark. Kalau dahulunya kita tahu Perdana Menteri daripada New Zealand itu. Ada juga Sir Lawrence Friedman dan juga Maria Fujihara. Apa yang kita dapat jangkakan dan juga bagaimana pemilihan speaker-speaker ini akan dapat mencetuskan satu perkara yang cukup dinantikan, dan mungkin tease sedikit atau memberikan sedikit bayangan apa yang kita dapat jangkakan daripada sesi pada petang ini.
Jika kita perhatikan sepanjang hari berlangsungnya WEF ini, masuklah ke sesi mana sekarang, dia berbalik kepada isu yang sama. Kita bercakap tentang uneven recovery. Kita sedang melangkah dalam proses pemulihan dan uneven. Proses pemulihan di tingkat global juga kita saksikan ketidaksamaan dan satu solusi yang tidak sekata dapat dibuat kerana ia berbalik kepada kombinasi mengikut kepada backdrop negara dan juga underlying issues yang dihadapi oleh negara-negara terlibat. Pertama, dan kedua ni kita melihat tentang bagaimana food price inflation ini ataupun krisis inflasi makanan ini. Kita lebih dekat kepada krisis inflasi makanan kerana impaknya direct. Terutamanya kepada golongan lower income ataupun negara berpendapatan rendah dan negara sedang membangun. Bagaimana ini dapat ini akan diketengahkan, pastinya akan disentuh oleh Menteri Kewangan maupun Helen Clark sendiri pun, kerana isu ini dia ada direct impact, direct correlation. Dan terusnya poin yang ketiga adalah akan dijangkakan kepada dua poin tersebut. Kita tidak boleh lari. Yang paling penting adalah balik kepada how to improve our livelihood. Bagaimana untuk memperhebatkan terutamanya bagaimana kualiti hidup kita di negara masing-masing. Tetapi kita tidak boleh lupa pendekatan yang digunakan, terutamanya blok Eropah, blok Barat dan blok Timur, harus melihat pada isu yang dihadapi ataupun bagaimana struktur ekonomi dan juga struktur sosial ekonomi masyarakat di negara tersebut dan polisi yang ada. Pastinya mereka akan mencari jalan tengah. Apakah jalan yang terbaik? Because kerana ia bukan satu polisi one size fits all yang boleh kita apply, yang boleh kita tetapkan di atas meja dan semua boleh ikut. Contohnya seperti jika kita perhatikan antara yang kita mendepani, yang kita berdepan ketika ini adalah adakah sistem subsidi kita ni ada di peringkat yang atau melihat kepada fiskal dan juga keupayaan kewangan negara. Dan pada masa sama, bagaimana kumpulan-kumpulan dan player-player perniagaan, pemain-pemain industri dapat melangkah lebih jauh dengan melihat pada sistem subsidi yang telah kita guna pakai ini. Ia juga dibincangkan seperti negara-negara di rantau ASEAN sendiri pun bercakap tentang subsidi yang lebih bersasar. Ini pastinya itu dan dibincangkan di dalam sesi yang bakal berlangsung di dalam situation room ini. Saya rasa Menteri Kewangan Datuk Zafrul telah pun ada di dalam sedang menantikan masa yang akan sampai masa sesi ini akan berjalan.
Kita ada 2 minit untuk menuju ke sesi itu, sesi Global Risk in an Era of Turbulence, di mana sesi ini akan disertai oleh Menteri Kewangan Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul bersama dengan Helen Clark dari bekas Perdana Menteri New Zealand yang menggalas kapasiti di peringkat global ketika ini, dan juga lagi 2 minit, tapi dalam masa berbaki 2 minit sebelum kita menyertai sesi itu, Najib, mungkin Ashot menyebut mengenai cerita mengenai mengimbangkan antara keperluan subsidi dan juga realiti sebenar ekonomi. Najib juga berkesempatan untuk menembual beberapa orang penting di KWSP dan juga di Khazanah dan sebagainya. Sukar tak untuk mencari formula yang terbaik untuk Malaysia di antara realiti sebenar dan juga kehendak yang bersifat populis? Bagaimana, Najib?
Okey, ini adalah menuntut keseimbangan GLIC kita yang hadir ke sini untuk memahami strategi yang lebih ampuh untuk mereka laksanakan. Kerana betul apa yang Zul katakan, ada kalanya mereka perlu melihat kepada solusi jangka pendek yang lebih bersifat populis. Ini tidak dapat dielakkan kerana itulah lumrahnya pada masa kini. Namun pada masa yang sama, apabila saya menemu bual mereka ini, saya tanyakan strategi kerana ini cukup penting kerana sudah 2 tahun mereka melalui pandemik COVID-19 dengan cabaran yang besar. Dan kalau kita bercakap soal KWSP sebagai contoh, mereka antara yang paling menjadi tumpuan sepanjang pandemik ini kerana mereka perlu melaksanakan 4 sesi pengeluaran KWSP dan sebagainya. Menyusun kembali strategi itu bagi KWSP adalah mungkin bukan perkara yang mudah kerana perlu melihat asset allocation yang tepat, asset class yang tepat dan sebagainya untuk kembali meraih keuntungan supaya distribution pengagihan itu lebih bersifat kepada mencapai sasaran yang digariskan dan sebagainya. Bermaksud pada akhirnya, kesemua solusi ini tidak boleh hanya bersifat sebelah pihak ataupun satu solusi untuk semua sekali. Semua pihak di setiap peringkat, leadership kena kuat, governance abirus kena kuat dan juga sumber kita yang terhad ini harus dipertingkatkan dan kerjasama yang rapat ini harus dirapatkan lagi untuk memastikan bahawa tepatlah strategi itu. Kerana kalau sebelah pihak saja yang terlebih strategi, sebelah pihak lagi tidak melaksanakan dengan baik, ia tidak menjadi juga. Sebab itu dasar kerajaan yang digariskan dalam apa jua penyelesaian harus disambut di peringkat GLIC, di peringkat corporate, di peringkat masyarakat sivil sekalipun. Termasuk kita, orang kebanyakan ini untuk memahami dasar itu dan melaksanakannya di peringkat kita. Contohnya, KWSP mengatakan bahawa pentingnya untuk literasi kewangan mereka pasca pengeluaran KWSP. Ini terus dididik untuk orang ramai faham bahawa penting untuk mereka ada kesedaran ini, ada pengurusan yang lebih baik kewangan supaya mereka lebih berdaya tahan di masa hadapan, Zul.
Saya kira kita sudah mendapat feed ataupun kita mendapat siaran atau daripada forum antara sesi yang terakhir WF kali ini iaitu Global Risk in Era of the Turbulence. Mungkin kita terus sahaja ke Davos untuk mengikuti sesi yang turut disertai oleh Menteri Keuangan Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul. Kita teruskan sahaja.
Changed so much for us. I know Maria will address that with expertise because all of this technology comes out of a coffee shop just outside San Francisco. We welcome you. The panel is outstanding and particularly made so because the most important German in the Valley is on our panel today. Klaus Regling, wonderful to have you. And we note that the Chancellor of Germany is speaking now to many here in Davos, and we're honored that Klaus Regling would take time to be with us. First of all, I didn't know what a QR code was until I came to Davos. We're going to do a poll. They're going to put up the QR code because you know how to do this and I don't. You put your phone up and go, and it's an important poll, and there are many items to choose from. And the team here will come up with your results of risks forward. And what I love about this, unlike what I do, including after this panel to New York, is this is an adult discussion of medium and long-term risks. And of course, all of these panelists, that's what they do 24/7. They're not worried about the short-term breathlessness of TV or radio. And we ask you to consider this poll with a risk forward, medium, and long-term. And there'll be, again, a really carefully curated set of ideas to choose from. And we hope to have the results of the poll sometime before the next meeting in January. I think we'll have it here as we go along. I am noted at panels not to give you fancy bios of our guests because they're all so accomplished. I could spend easily 10 minutes on each. Minister, thank you so much for joining. Helen Clark needs no introduction with her efforts after her service to New Zealand. Maria Fujihara is on the absolute cutting edge of, I dare put these two words together, but engineering process and carbon. There's lots of blah, blah, blah about carbon, and she and Ev Williams have said, how about if we count it? And they're really, really out front on that. Klaus Regling's contribution through the IMF into Germany is known. And I'm particularly pleased to have with us Sir Lawrence Friedman today. We give all equal time, but I'll be honest, this is a 1-hour panel. I could speak to each of these individuals for an hour. Sir Lawrence is shockingly out front on what we're all focused on in Ukraine. So we're going to get right to it now as you consider that poll. Prime Minister Clark, I want to begin with you, if I could, with your service in this pandemic, because you go into meetings that are slow motion and you say, let's go, pick it up. There's going to be a pick it up after this pandemic, and there is a discussion of being prepared for the next pandemic. What will that process look like? What is the process to get prepared for the next risk for the World Health Organization?
So I think the preparedness is at the two levels. There's the national level, and then there's what needs to happen to the global architecture. Of course, we're not through the pandemic, so we're trying to prepare for what might be around the corner, or might be 10 years away, it might be tomorrow, who knows. But we're still fighting this one, so that's another story. But on the national level, I think it's critical that every country does a no-holds-bar review of how they performed, because no one performed ideally. Many performed extremely suboptimally. When I was Prime Minister, we did a review of how we reacted to the threat of SARS. And one of the outcomes of that was purpose-built legislation called the Epidemic Preparedness Act, 2006. And that was able to be taken off the shelf for this pandemic, supplementing the provisions of the Public Health Act. So I would say every country needs to go through, look at the state of its law and regulation, and then look at all the things you need to do to be prepared locally. Keep your surveillance capacity. Make sure your lab infrastructure's there, your basic supplies that you need on hand. Can you suddenly tap millions of masks, PPE equipment, is the oxygen there? So that's at the national level, lots to do. And our panel was also clear that heads of state and government have to be seized with this. So often, and I would say in most places prior to this pandemic, the person who dealt with the pandemic was a desk officer, a focal point for the international health regulations buried in the health ministry. It had no visibility at the top level at all. This is something that requires whole of government coordination with the most senior person engaged, and most definitely finance and all the other key sectors very engaged because of the wide range of impact. Just, a note on the global level, I think the wheels do grind very, very slowly. They are grinding, mostly on process. In the opinion of our panel, you could actually do quite a quick and dirty amendment to the international health regulations to give the WHO the power to be much more decisive. Let's face it, weeks were wasted initially with the pandemic because they didn't have the power to get to the site, to publish the information that they had but couldn't get permission from the host country to publish, to take a precautionary approach, and then the emergency committee mess them around for a full week when it shouldn't. The IHR need to provide for WHO to cut through all that. The ongoing architecture, obviously Americans have given big leadership on this new fund at the World Bank. The money's got to be raised for it. There's ongoing negotiation on some kind of new legal instrument, shall we say, form and content unspecific. And then I suppose my two last key points would be that we need to thoroughly review what happened with this access to COVID tools accelerator and the COVAX facility, because it was designed on the fly, and we need something rather better for the future. The other thing is we need global leadership and coordination, which we haven't had, and we will keep thumping on the head of government level.
That's where I want to go with you. I would suggest respectfully, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you're of the Labour or Liberal persuasion.
Yep.
And the issue I see country to country is a more conservative mean, often anti-science, country to country. I'm not picking on the United States of America, but there's a more conservative mean that is anti-science, anti-microbiology, anti-virology. How does the center tendency drag a conservative thrust into pandemic preparation for the next risk?
So, I mean, even in countries which had that political phenomenon and a suboptimal response, there were people trying to do incredible things on the professional side, and Anthony Fallacy, I think, in the US is just a standout example of just keeping a laser focus on the issues. So I believe that even in political systems where politics isn't particularly conducive, you will have structures, whether they're CDCs, health ministries, where people will be onto it. They know it's got to be done. They'll keep the planning going. With any luck, they might have a minister whose ear they've got, and they will be able to respond.
Okay, thank you so much. Minister, if I could come to you, please. And we're going to have an eclectic set of risks here, which I think show the tension here at these May meetings to the January meeting. Minister, I want to talk about a short-term risk. You need to get live chickens from Malaysia down to Singapore. And right now, this is a problem because of this horrific food crisis we confront. And you and your government are, on a micro basis, like getting chickens to Singapore, are dealing with this right now. Extend out in the cauldron, as Robert T. Kaplan says, Asia's cauldron, how your government will approach not so much the present food crisis, but the planning long term. And particularly around rice and around export-import. And we must admit, you have a set of foods right now, including your palm oil, where you're struggling with this.
Yep. Well, first of all, thank you, Thom. Well, as a policymaker, these are the challenges that we are facing today. Food prices, and for Malaysia as well. But when it comes to food security, we are still okay. And if we look at the next 12 months, 12 months horizon, we can see that there's an uneven recovery, right, alongside other uncertainties surrounding global, what we've been discussed again. And the global supply chain relates back to the chicken, palm oil, and all that. And of course, Malaysia is also a net exporter of commodities. So that has somewhat cushioned the impact of inflation to us, to Malaysia. The other issue is, you know, when we look at the global risks for Malaysia and also the region, we've been having a discussion with my other counterparts in Southeast Asia, we must ensure digital transformation as well, benefits all, amid there's a shorter innovation cycle, and ensuring that no one is left behind. So that's one of the risks that we're monitoring. The digital acceleration has benefited the region, but it also showed that there's gaps within communities and within countries in the region. Thirdly, another risk factor that we must acknowledge is that we need to continue to focus on the socio-economic gaps that is between countries in the region and also within the country. And this is across groups, across genders, and it's something that, you know, this pandemic has shown that, you know, it illustrates further the problems that we already faced before, but it's now become more apparent. And finally, we've been hearing this in Davos, it's about the transition risk to a greener and also more climate resilient economy, right? And it's something I think most of you here are aware, the financial sector also plays an important role. So if we look at the speed which the economy transitions to greener one, it will be different again from one community or one country to another, but there are risks. So there's also now more risk on what's happening today globally.
Malaysia has had an extraordinary courage in the Pacific Rim of saying, COVID, we're going to come out of it, we're going to lead, and as you mentioned, one of those indicators is a lower inflation. Assess the risk as China, and I mean this in a constructive way, as China comes out of lockdown. Not so much what does it mean for your Malaysia, I know that's inappropriate, but if China comes out of lockdown, what is the risks that unleashes, including, I would suggest, a boom of the Pacific Rim economies?
Yeah. Well, to Malaysia, China is our largest trading partner. And you're right, Tom, the lockdown has an impact to all the trading partners in China. And the lockdown has been more severe than we thought, and it's been longer than we anticipate. And that obviously has a negative impact to the supply chain. And being an open economy like Malaysia, where it's our 120% of our trade to GDP is 120%, that's an impact. But if you're talking about the spillover, once they start to lift the lockdowns, I think it will be a positive one, and it's a manageable one. If you look at the GDP growth for Malaysia, for example, last quarter is around 5%, and we are on track to achieve the growth target of around 5.5% to 6.5%, and therefore we just increased rates 2 weeks ago in light of the strengthening of our economy.
Do you want to give me a ringgit forecast right now? That's probably not going to work. How are we doing on the polling? Are we continuing on? We're going to have results before January? Okay. We're working on it. Maria.
Can't read them.
Oh, it's up here? Oh, it's up. Oh, there they are. The results are over there.
Behind you.
Thank you. You've got it perfect for my eyesight.
It's behind you.
Failure of climate change mitigation and adoption.
Behind you.
I see it behind me, but I also see it over here.
Oh, you can read.
With my Ted Williams eyesight, I can see it.
Amazing.
Collapse of lack of social security. Okay, that's interesting. Very interesting.
I can't see it.
And what I see here immediately is the even distribution and the many different opinions here. Moving from, and for those of you seeing this on a worldwide stream, cost of living crisis, to me this is something of the threats of global slowdown and how the middle class will be affected. That is always the case. Geoeconomic confrontations, we'll get to that with Sir Lawrence. Failure of climate change mitigation and adoption is perfect to bring in Maria Fujihara, which is the rarest of rare things, and I'm going to sell you right now. Is it Sinai? Is that how you pronounce it? I got it right. Good. Evan Williams is one of the few people in the technology space, and he's got the look, the black T-shirt, and the whole thing, but he actually has a BS factor of 0, and Maria is one of his offspring here, and this is about engineering process and carbon. Tell me how you mitigate the risk long-term in carbon by engineering process and accountability.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for your question and for being here. So there are two main types of risks around climate change: physical and non-physical risks. The non-physical are the ones that we call it transitional risks. So the physical risks are normally associated with physical impacts of, assets, floods, fires, this kind of thing. We are very focused on the other type of risks, which are the transitional risks on the corporation perspective, that are associated mostly with 4 main things, which is policies and regulations. The second one are economic factors and finance. The third is technological roadmap and transition. And the fourth is reputation. Our company, our software platform, help corporations to actually manage the technological roadmap for transitioning. So finding solutions that are gonna replace existing dirty operations and understanding what is the cost of implementing those technologies, which at the end is gonna be associated with the financial impact and financial risk with, delaying the implementation of those technologies.
What's changed medium and long term with a guess that hydrocarbons will be higher in price medium, and long term. Prime Minister Clark is the only one in the room who knows what Newcastle coal is. It's out of a country near New Zealand.
Correct.
And Newcastle coal is such a moonshot, it's not a standard deviation study. How does your world change, Maria, with what we see with nat gas, what we see with coal?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we help corporations to calculate internal carbon prices, which is essentially the cost of investing in new technology. Right now, you know, we do have a good pool of cheaper technology that can be implemented immediately, but these costs are going to increase, as you mentioned, over the time, mostly because there will be more investments in new technologies that are gonna be for a while under R&D, right? And they need to do research and development, so the costs are gonna be increasing. So it's very important for corporations to understand how much is it gonna cost for them to delay this implementation, and today it's very much high. So if they don't allocate capital, and roughly, I would say corporations are allocating roughly $50 million per year on new technology.
Right.
But this is going to increase over time.
Quickly, is big oil on board?
Well, we do focus on the carbon-intensive companies, the dirty ones. We don't have any oil and gas customer right now.
Next year. Okay, fine, very good.
But we have others.
I'm getting over here to Sir Lawrence, who I think has been just truly worldwide exceptional. My book of the year is by Angela Sten on Mr. Putin. I want to get to Sir Lawrence on that. But first we need to talk about the economics of Sir Lawrence's true war expertise. Klaus Regling, Germany is front and center right now on the economics on the Eastern Front from Helsinki down to Istanbul. How do you suggest we should look at the medium and long-term risks economically of this hydrocarbon wall between Russia and Europe, which seems to be being built right now?
I think Europe as a whole, including Germany, has started a journey to become much less dependent on Russian energy. There's a clear plan in place. Reliance was, with hindsight, clearly too high for Germany, but not only, also other countries in the eastern part of the European Union. This is being reduced as we speak. And will continue. There's a very clear plan in place. The European Commission has put out a plan how to spend money on becoming less dependent on Russian energy. In the short run, if Putin were to cut off oil gas exports to Europe, to Western Europe, it would be very costly. We know that, but that's not the baseline scenario at the moment. At the baseline, actually, the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine, which of course has a terrible humanitarian consequences, but when I look at the growth figures, the slowdown is not that dramatic compared to other crises we had the last few years, COVID-19 or the global financial crisis. It's much, much smaller, the economic impact in terms of a lost growth. It's about 1/4 only. That's the baseline scenario. If energy imports from Russia were to stop next week, then of course we are not in a baseline scenario, then we are in a high risk scenario, and then we would have an output loss that would be comparable to other crises. But that's not the assumption, and in the baseline scenario we will gradually reduce dependency on Russian oil imports. That may actually stop the next few weeks. Gas takes longer. But over the next 2 years, there's a clear plan how to do that as well.
Out beyond 2 years, and I think of your public service to Germany, to Helmut Kohl, your work at the IMF, out over 2 years, the medium and long-term constructive risk or constructive optimism of the radical change we've seen since February 24th in Europe. Speaking with Stubbs of Finland, speaking to Stockholm yesterday as I did, and down to the tensions at the Bosphorus Strait. Tell us what Europe looks like in 3 or 5 years, given these shocks from this war.
These shocks, we would much prefer not to have seen them or to be in the middle of another one right now. But the unintended consequences can be a positive one. We see it in NATO. but we also see it with European integration. The war is accelerating steps towards more integration. You mentioned Finland, Sweden joining NATO, and much more cohesion in NATO right now. The same is happening in the European Union. There, I would expect over the next few years steps for more integration. President Macron has talked about it, Mario Draghi from Italy has talked about it. It's in the German coalition agreement to develop Europe further towards what Mario Draghi calls a pragmatic federalism. It's ambitious, and without the war probably would have been impossible. Now I think it might well happen the next few years.
Can I ask a token Bloomberg question? Thank you. Is there going to be a pragmatic combined fiscal policy of Europe? Which is a really important question.
Yeah, I think fiscal policy in Europe is better than its reputation.
That was a wrangling response. If you, that's like what I would get. I have to read this to you. In 18 years at Davos, this is the most extraordinary paragraph written 4 years ago, and you talk about looking out the medium and long-term risks. The fallacy of the decisive first move. Historically, the fallacy of the decisive first move has been a regular source of bad military strategy. It has meant that wars have been started that then turned out to be difficult to conclude. Expectations that an opponent caught off guard would crumble quickly were based on either assumptions of military weakness or a stressed society, or that the country would be run by a comedian. Sir Lawrence, that is the single greatest paragraph I have seen at any panel at Davos. Sir Lawrence, 4 years ago, writing on Ukraine, read it for the brief. I'm going to cut to the chase, Sir Lawrence. You and I are on the same page. This is about the risks of the Black Sea. Define those risks, medium and long term.
Well, the risks are short term. I mean, they're very short term, because there's a whole load of grain stuck there in Odessa, which needs to get out. And if it doesn't get out in the next matter of weeks, then the new grain that's being harvested has got nowhere to be stored, and a world food crisis that is pretty awful at the moment because of droughts and so on is going to get that much worse. I mean, it's a short-term and immediate risk. As far as I'm aware, there's a lot of work going on, which has to be, in this case, has to be led by the UN, because somehow you've got to get the Russians a bit on board on this, and the Turks, because they've got to let ships through the Black Sea. So you can't just through the Straits of Bosphorus. You can't just do it by a NATO operation, but you will need warships and so on, just in case some rogue Russian ships start firing. And it's a shipping issue because of insurance. It's a very complex, but it's here and now, and it's an example of how war creates new risks. The bit you kindly quoted, I mean, the point, if you can get a war over quickly, say the Six-Day War in 1967, then that's it. But any war that goes on for any length of time, the economic and social and wider political factors become progressively more important, and even can begin to outweigh those that started the conflict in the first place.
Within your reading of history, and the easy solution here is the Russians are in Crimea, and I believe Mr. Stoltenberg and company hold court in Romania. Is that enough to provide a neutrality in the Black Sea, to see a NATO Navy in Romania, a Russian Navy in Crimea, in some form of neutrality 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out?
I mean, you know, the Black Sea is covered by a 1936 convention. The Bulgaria and Romania are the two, sort of, as well as Turkey, are the NATO powers there. I think the Black Sea normally isn't that important. It's one of, you know, these places that all of a sudden acquire great geopolitical importance. And I would see over the longer term, it's how we see that particular sea is going to be part and parcel of how we see our attempts to come to terms again with Russia. It's part and parcel of that diplomacy. It matters a lot to Russia. It's Russia's sea, and it's got the one with the big fleet there.
I'm going to have some questions here. We have 34 minutes left, and I'm going to do a longer question period from the floor this time around, so start thinking about your important questions and observations for our panelists. Minister, I want to talk, is Sir Lawrence talks about the Black Sea as perhaps secondary, except for right now. Certainly that cannot be said of the South China Sea.
No.
And in terms of the risks of the Chinese Party Congress this fall, a reestablishment of whatever China is going to do, and a dotted line that goes out into territory near, far too near Malaysia, some would say. Assess the need to ameliorate the risks of the South China Sea.
Well, Malaysia's position and most of the countries in Southeast Asia, we are part of the non-aligned movement. So we obviously are trying to be neutral in this area, and we have been engaging China on the issue of South China Sea. And economically, like I mentioned earlier, China remains our major trading partner, in fact, the largest trading partner. So we will continue to engage China rather than not engage China. And they have to be fair to both countries. We have long-standing relationship. In fact, China is the first country since Malaysia gained independence. They were one of the first countries that we have had diplomatic ties with. But economically, like I said earlier, in the region, we are still facing some downside risks of what's happening in Europe, but also what's happening in China. So we are hoping that what's happening in China today, especially in the lockdown, will not disrupt the supply chain too much.
Can trade agreements ameliorate the risks of the future? We see a president of the United States to Northern Asia here in recent days. Many people that I speak to are shocked at the United States legislature, which pushes against TPP or any other set of alphabet soups as well. What is the best outcome for trade legislation to ameliorate the risks on the Pacific Rim?
Well, for Malaysia, the position is very clear. We are proponents of globalization, and we've seen the impact of going backwards, especially for a country as small as us. So definitely, we feel that any FTAs, any trade agreements, bilateral, multilateral with Malaysia, it's something that we will keen to pursue. Yeah, and it's the right thing to do in the long run.
We're talking about war here, and Helen Clark, I think there's been a war in medicine the last 3 or 4 years. It's been, you know, you really think, I live right near Mount Sinai in New York City, and just to observe the courage at Mount Sinai has been extraordinary. The WHO is on a war footing. You mentioned earlier the funding you need. How do you get the millions, indeed billions, and I'll be honest, not only on virus, but on the other mandates of WHO? How do you convince them to raise the funds to be ready for those medium and long-term risks?
So I think there's two issues. There's the issue of what does WHO need itself, and then what is needed for solidarity for low-income and low-middle-income countries to be prepared. And the solidarity is justified on the basis that a weak link anywhere in the chain becomes then a global risk to all of us in the event of a pandemic threat. On the WHO funding, there's been a little bit of good news. Our panel recommended that the member states should actually be paying 2/3 of the base program, which they agree on the budget for, 2/3 of that through membership fees. There's been an agreement brokered, thanks to incredible work by a German diplomat who headed the working group on this, where the member states are agreeing to lift that contribution from the current 16% to 50%, but it won't be fully in for another 4 budgets. So that keeps WHO still on relatively short base program rations for a while. And the other caveat I'd put is that when countries have to pay these extra fees, they may then give less in the discretionary and tagged funding. So whether it amounts to more overall, who knows? But there has been a bit of movement on seeing that WHO needs its core program and strength to be properly funded. Now, on the global funding, I mentioned the work the US has led on this financial intermediary fund. To be hosted at the World Bank. The assessment of our independent panel and of the G20 high-level independent panel on financing was that you need somewhere in the region of $10 to $15 billion every year to be supporting that preparedness function. We advocated a formula not unlike sort of member state assessed contributions based on size of economy and so on, from each according to their means, to each according to their needs. So while, say, Liberia would pay in, it would get immensely more back. That's the way it would work. That's not the way the design of the fund's going at the moment, and it does look like it will be a more classic donor fund with the founding donors having a lot of the say in it. I think there'll be pushback on that from the Global South, which would probably like to see a more inclusive approach to it. But hey, if Joe Biden and friends can rally $10 billion now per year for that fund, it's got to be a good thing, and it's got to go. But now, the other thing is the fund needs to be able to leverage up to $100 billion for the first 100 days response, because if the threat really does materialise, you need a lot of support to be put in. So, you know, wheels are grinding on these things. I'm relatively optimistic we'll get something. Whether it'll be ideal, who knows, but it'll be something.
Klaus Regling.
Yeah.
This is really a topic that's also coming from Europe, really worrying. Normally you ask me about European risks, and but here what I see happening in developing countries, emerging markets, and in a way the breakdown of multilateral cooperation around the world, I think this is a problem. The food price increase is leading to hunger in large parts of the world, particularly in Africa. And in those countries, people spend typically 40% of their income on food anyway. When food prices double, they cannot spend 80% of their income on food. It doesn't add up. And food prices are projected to continue to increase significantly. So the high energy prices, the food prices, I think is a real issue. It will lead to more debt problems in the least developed countries. The IMF tells us that 60% of the least developed countries have a debt problem already before the recent increase in energy and food prices. Right. So we need a lot of global cooperation, multilateralism, multilateral action to help. And I don't see that happening at the moment. It's good, the numbers you mentioned, the US giving 10 billion, but this is not enough. No. And the world order may be falling into different blocks, and that means the multilateral institutions like the WTO, but the whole United Nations system, IMF and World Bank, they will not be as efficient as they were in the past 50, 60 years, and that contributed greatly to our standard of living. They may not be able to work as well as in the past, given what we see happening in the world order.
I think we can say that the risk of food here getting into the end of 2022 is front and center, away from the horror of the war. Maria, away from engineering process and carbon, does climate change as a debate get pushed aside because rice, whichever the pricing is, Chicago rice or I believe it's, I look at TF, I know the codes on the Bloomberg, but I don't know what they mean. TFF, I think it's Amsterdam wheat, whatever it is. But does the debate over climate change become delayed because of our focus on the food issues Mr. Regling speaks of?
Definitely, but it's so complicated to evaluate climate change risk, and with every single risk come a huge opportunity as well. And I just want to connect back to the comment of the war, because to give you an example of how complicated this is. The DoD, the Department of Defense of the United States, is the single biggest emitter in the world. Nobody talks about that, but they are emitting a lot of carbon. And at the same time, they are the biggest investors in clean technology development. So they are getting public funding from the US government to invest in green technology development, so they can, you know, transition and maybe have a clean war. I don't know what that means, but and it's a huge problem, because we do need to invest in clean technology, but not under those costs, those type of costs that war brings. So it's very complex to manage this kind of risks and to pursue these opportunities. And there are, we can look at climate risks into two main point of view, so adaptation and mitigation. I'm sure you are familiar with these concepts, but if we don't mitigate, if we don't change the way we operate, we're going to continue going after chasing our own tails, because we are not changing the source or changing, where the problem is actually coming from. We're basically trying to put a Band-Aid on a bleeding
let me give you two case studies as I go to the minister here who's living this in real time. The one case study is the one we hear every year. The people show up at Davos, and you can see it at the Zurich airport on their Gulf Streams. And I guess there's a carbon use there. And I guess we're being green and we're going to fix that. But we still show up on our Gulf Streams. I make a joke about it. People think I own 2 Gulf Streams. It's a joke that we have. I don't. But many do. And so there's that stereotype. But then there's also the agony of the carbon use of agriculture, whether it's rice, corn, or wheat. Can you count the carbon use to begin the process of agriculture?
We can, yeah, absolutely.
How do you do it?
So we use scientific methodologies for that are many. I'm originally from Brazil, so both of my parents are also in the climate space. My dad has actually a farm. And
in southern Brazil? I was just reading about this, like they're looking to have a boom wheat operation because nobody else can do it.
Yeah.
Odessa's shut down, right?
Yeah, so we can calculate, and there's a lot of misunderstanding around the numbers as well. For example, we just calculated recently from, I'm not going to name anybody, but from a big seed producer in the country. And there is a lot of misconception. They think that most of the emissions comes from soybean production, but it actually came from corn production because of how these two types of seeds are produced and the technologies used in local, which also varies depending on the location. But if you don't actually put numbers into it, and that's my background, math and engineering, I need to put numbers into everything from carbon accounting to finance. We're always going to be, having shallow conversations. So we always blame soybean producers, but there are other main sources of emissions as well.
There's a comedian in America and in the Philippines named Joe Coy. And he has a very famous line, which is unfortunately not true, which is why it's funny. But he says, rice is rice, except right now it's not funny. This is serious stuff, Minister. The dynamics of rice and the localization of rice is a huge risk. I studied this 10 years ago with the UN. I was worried about it as an amateur, and the UN said, calm down. They were correct. This time around, 2 years out, 5 years out, do we have control of this core commodity for Asia? Can we maintain either the price or the domestic government support of the price for people?
Yep. Well, that's a tough question, because if you look at what's happening in the region, that's the staple food, right? Rice for Southeast Asia. It's very important. For Malaysia, we're not self-sufficient for rice. We're 70% domestic, but 30% is imported. Vietnam, Thailand, they're all self-sufficient. So there's a lot of government assistance to ensure that supply is secure. And also at the same time, subsidies, a large amount of subsidies that are allocated to ensure that the price is also maintained, given the importance of rice to Malaysians and everyone else in the region. So this has been a challenge, especially when the cost of producing has gone up. And we are seeing that countries all over the region are being asked to step up. But Malaysia, just to give you a sense,
please,
subsidy in terms of numbers, we usually subsidize to the tune of 30 billion ringgit. This year, it will be 71 billion ringgit. That's why the inflation is still low at 2%, but that's core inflation. Food inflation is actually up 4%. And you're right about the basket. So the vulnerable groups obviously will be facing bigger challenges, given that the basket of food is much higher. And these are the average household consumption is the assumption for inflation. And at the same time, we are lucky because some of the countries in the region do not have the commodity resources. You can see where the oil price is today. And most countries may not have the opportunity to create revenue from the increase in commodity prices to cushion the impact of the food prices.
Sir Lawrence, I want you to summarize this before we go to the floor, looking at medium and long-term risks. And I'm supposed to ask a smart and narrow question, but your scope and scale on war, and I'm just thinking quickly on food, Napoleon went up to Moscow and I think food got in the way. Hitler went up to Moscow, food got in the way. Link in this food crisis and of course the immediacy of the Ukraine wheat issues and such, but link it into a general study of war. How does food inflation get in the way of the certitude of war?
Well, think 2011. What prompted what we called optimistically the Arab Spring was food inflation. When you put together these cumulative crises, whether they come from climate change, whether they come from pandemics, whether they come from cost of living or famine or whatever, it often ends up with instability, with governments being challenged, sometimes being overthrown, repression as they try to hold things calm. So it's bleak, and I think that, to me, is one of the reasons why there should be such urgency in looking at the situation at the moment, because you can't expect societies to stay calm and together and coherent when you're having these multiple shocks coming at them and people just can't live and become desperate. So there's a very clear link. What's unusual about this war at the moment is it's a war between two states. Most wars of recent times have been civil wars. Most wars have started with insurrections or secessionist movements or whatever. You can argue this one did, but it wasn't really like that. And that's the sort that we're likely to see prompted by these multiple crises. So it's not a very optimistic prospect.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
Because you're asking what is the impact of in the food based on the war. So Brazil is, they import 80% of their fertilizers come from Russia. Right. And they're not going to be able to produce any of these commodities that are the biggest exports from Brazil if they stop buying fertilizers from Russia. So Russia exports many different things, but I do think that one of the biggest problems with the food shortage is actually the logistics. It's not real the production, and this impacts the climate change with transporting all these goods all over. So it's complex, not simple.
Before I go to the floor, I have one selfish question of Sir Lawrence Friedman. One of the magic moments of my life was a wonderful relationship with Thomas Schelling, and I stood with him in Chicago, 2 floors below in a ginormous hotel, 4 or 5 of us in a room with Professor Schelling. And one of the gentlemen from Asia said, Thomas Schelling, how do wars end? Lawrence Friedman, how do wars end?
They end sometimes with clear victories, sometimes with proper surrenders. Often they peter out, but sometimes they just keep on going. And if you look at African wars, they subside a bit and then they come back again. Look at the Congo. You know, when can you really say the Congo has been at peace since its independence in 1961? It's in many parts of the world. It's a fact of life that economics and so on is organised around continual conflict and violence. For us in Europe, you know, we've seen our big ones, and we have a shocking event at the moment, but they're hard. I think people at the moment with Ukraine have got this idea in that there's a deal to be done, and that, you know, Zelensky has to be persuaded of this and Putin has to be persuaded of that. But as long as one side thinks it hasn't lost, wars will continue.
I would like to go to questions to our great panelists. Identify who you'd like to address to or to all, and let's have a good 14 minutes here of questions. Anyone, please? Sir.
I want what you think about the weaponizing of the dollar, the SWIFT, in this war. How do you think that has long-term consequences and add to the risks that we may be facing in the future? Thank you.
I mean, in some way, I mean, it's a question for Klaus as well. I think it's unavoidable to a degree, because you look around and you think of something that you can do, and there's a performative aspect of sanctions. It demonstrates concern. How can you do business with these people, and so on. And then you hope it has a coercive effect. That mentioned Tom Schelling, who was all about coercion. But that takes time. And then you have an effect where it makes it difficult to manufacture. So Russians can't get components, they can't manufacture tanks and so on. So all of those aspects are important with sanctions. And when you get something as intense as this war, it increases. Now, the area that I think where you move into the interesting precedent question is current views that all this money that has been frozen, all this Russian money that has been frozen, should be seized and handed over to the Ukrainians for reconstruction, which has a sort of justice to it. And the EU is looking at it. It's been considered in Congress. A lot of bankers are very nervous about the implications of that. So I think so far, I mean, if you look at the Chinese, and they get really anxious every time anybody talks about sanctions, because they see it as directed at them. They have the secondary sanctions, and a lot of sanctions haven't done much good. So I think part of the challenge is to develop a conversation that is focused on where sanctions really can have an effect, and not just and to reduce the performative aspect, which may make people feel better. So just to conclude, you mentioned Russian fertilizers and so on. If there's going to be some deal on the Black Sea, Russia's going to want something out of that, because you can't do it just against their opposition. And so that's going to raise a question about what sanctions do you ease in order to get the grain out.
Klaus?
Yeah, just to add, and I agree with what you say, many sanctions in the past have not worked. I think these sanctions do work. The idea is to really hit the Russian economy. And I think we are seeing that, and over time it will get worse. It does not mean that all economic activity in Russia comes to a standstill, because Russia has its own internal system. They already gave up using American credit cards some time ago. They have their own system. China is developing an alternative system to SWIFT. It's still small. It's about only 10% of the volume of SWIFT. But over time, that will grow. And then a lot will depend how China will behave. Will it help Russia to find ways out without SWIFT or not? We don't have any experience on that. So these are all questions that are on the table. There's also sometimes the argument used that this might weaken the role of the dollar as a dominant currency in the international monetary system, freezing reserves that are kept in dollars. Some reserves are also kept in euro, central bank reserves of Russia. And there also we don't have experience. On that one, I don't see it happening anytime soon, because what's the alternative? Some countries are shifting some of their foreign exchange reserves to smaller third countries like Australia, Sweden, Switzerland, but they are too small to take up really the volume that the dollar or the euro can take up. So I hope that over time we can move back to a multilateral system where all this operates smoothly, but at the moment it's worrying.
And Prime Minister Clark, you've lived this, but the fact is distant sanctions end up diminishing global trade, and they lead to a true regionalism, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, the sanctions issue's been interesting in New Zealand because we have so little trade with Russia that it's almost performative, to use the Lawrence's phrase. But yeah, I mean, world trade
it puts a cloud over it.
Oh, yeah, it's a major shadow over world trade, which won't grow in the way it needs to get us out of the problems that COVID left us with.
Another question, sir. Oh, over here. Okay. Yes, you do.
Hi, my name is Nayeli. I wanted to ask you a question about internet and cyber attacks. I recently went to lunch with a friend. I work at a global bank in Switzerland, which recently got hacked. And we were talking in frustrations at lunch. She works at Unilever, and her supply chain system was hacked the same day. And I said, out of frustration, people can't access their money. And she said, but people can't access food if the supply chain is hacked. So how do you see this huge global risk that is the internet today, and how it is shaping the world?
This is a huge question. There was a moment with Ken Rogoff of Harvard, I'm going to say 15 years ago, and he sent me, Tom, you know what's going to flip all this up? And he said logistics around technology, and there it is, the internet. Let me begin, Maria, with you, because you're in the vicinity of the San Francisco Giants. We just take it for granted, don't we?
Well, I think we are learning, right? The internet is moving much faster than policies are being created or that companies can actually catch. And yeah, hack attacks and all of this kind of...
Full disclosure, I've been fully hacked. I've been wiped out. Somebody in Turkey didn't like what I said, boom. So I've lived it. Continue.
Yeah, I think it has been probably, it has been at the same time that climate change has, come into this public discussions. I think cyber attack and the internet kind of started together. And they are moving both very slow. I think maybe the internet regulations are moving a little faster than the climate regulations, but I think we're still learning. Honestly, it's a real issue. It's a real huge risk that we are learning how to cope with. I don't have much more to add.
Klaus, please.
I think it's a real big risk. And it's very different from climate change, because climate change, we know what's happening, and we know what will happen if we don't address the problems. Cyber risk is different, because everybody knows it's out there. You hope it doesn't hit you, but it may, and when it happens, it would have serious consequences. So also my own institution, the ESM, we have an annual risk exercise where we try to identify our top risks, and cyber risk is always at the top. Because it's something you don't know when it hits, but you know it may hit. And most of the financial sector institutions, banks, insurances, they also put cyber risk at top.
When you go into those meetings, is it about 3 guys in a bedroom in a given country? Or who's the bad guy?
You don't know. It can be individuals, it can be countries supporting them. We know that cyber attacks have gone up after the war in Ukraine started, and we know that Russia has been behind much of it, but not only. There can be individuals. You talked about a guy in Turkey who hacked you.
Big time.
There are different type of people. Some say it as a sport to try to block a company or an individual. We know many companies had to close down for a week or months because they could not operate anymore. So it is a risk for everybody.
What's really strange here, folks, and this is stressful, is the gentleman from Malaysia is wearing his beautiful Malaysian pin in red. It's not about Malaysia. It's about Liverpool. And they killed Tottenham. I just think next year, if we get Conte and we get some signings, I think there's a threat to Liverpool, don't you think?
We'll see on Saturday.
We'll see on Saturday. Right. I want to talk to you, Minister, because Malaysia, my basic experience is the technology that your beautiful question brought up has been a massive advantage to the GDP expansion, the societal expansion of Malaysia and so much of the Pacific Rim. How do you manage the cybersecurity threat?
Yeah, I agree with all the panelists here. Cybersecurity is the #1 threat. In fact, I was running a bank before, and we also had cyber attacks, and there was like 170 knocks a day, at least, on our dashboard. At one time, it was actually a ransomware which was planted years, and suddenly they activate, and they wanted us to pay in cryptos. So these are the challenges. And when obviously the government now in Malaysia, during the pandemic, we had to use technology as our main platform to assist various groups. In fact, all the cash assistance are all done through online payment directly to their accounts. And at this time, we do know that the risk is very high because there will be areas where this data, there's so much data today that we got during this pandemic, because when you want to receive assistance, you give your real data, your phone number, your address, your bank account. Today is not knowing the unknown, right? So like what I said, we don't know who will one day come, but we try and our best to monitor the situation, working with the various agencies. But I must admit, it's going to be very tough to know what's out there, right?
Who has a microphone? They have the power. We discovered that over here. Sir, right here, please.
Okay, glad to have power in my hands. My question is to Minister Zafrul, and I'll be happy if anybody else answers. I'm an author and writer from India. Now, the definition of global risk seems to be emanating from a very Eurocentric perspective. For you, Russia is a global risk. For me, in India, and for several people and several countries, including in Asia, China is the risk. So it appears that when you talk about a food crisis, it's because Ukraine is under fire. But food crises have happened in the rest of the world for several decades earlier, and nobody spoke about it with the same kind of vehemence that we see today. So my question to all of you is that the definition of global risk has to be A, more inclusive, B, I think it's more regional than perhaps global. So perhaps on technology, there could be a global risk, but on geopolitics, there is no such thing as a global risk. It's the interpretation. Today, Russia is a global risk, but once China attacks you, you'll see China as a global risk. So that's a question, Minister Zafrul, and anybody else.
I think you just took a shot at the media. We are so guilty of this, sir. I can't find words for how accurate you are, and we live it every day. And I'll be honest, I have a whole set of managers at Bloomberg saying, Tom, there's another side of the world because we're so focused on the game of TV and radio. I used to work at Bloomberg. Oh, did you? Oh, so Peter Grauer planted you here. Perfect. Would someone, may we start with you, Minister, yes, and I want to get others in here as well, about the narrowness of our view looking at medium and long-term risks.
I'll be short and brief. The problem with governments, I agree with you as well. We look at solution in a linear way, right? We subscribe to this and thinking that this is the solution. It's one variable, a linear way. So similarly, that's how global views are formed, right? But actually, in this region, the main issue is not so much inflation or food inflation. It's other challenges that we're facing. So you're right, China is one. But I absolutely agree with what was said just now. Agree, completely in agreement.
I have to run here in 1 minute, 42 seconds or whatever it is. The final word from the person that's lived the greatest risks of all of us, Helen Clark, grew up in a harbor in New Zealand with a volcano underneath it, bubbling, and she knew every day when she went to school she could die the next day. Forget about the medium term. What's your short-term risk right now?
Well, look, the short-term risks are obviously how we come out of the pandemic and also dealing with the global food crisis. But I think the question's right. We focus very much on the short term. There's other big things hanging over us. The climate risk is existential, and you know, our attention is completely distracted by it now. In fact, probably one of the fallouts from the Ukraine crisis will be more people using coal because they can't access the gas. So I think for me the issue is how to turn these challenges into opportunities. There's a huge opportunity to accelerate the energy transition now, which would be positive for addressing the climate crisis. And I think if policymakers would try and look for some of these win-wins out of what look like daunting odds, that would be helpful.
Thank you all so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you to all of you and out on the internet as well.
Yeah.
mengancam kualiti hidup manusia seluruh dunia. But dia pelbagai. Di rantau Asia berbeza, Asia Tenggara berbeza, di Eropah pastinya berbeza. Apa yang penekanan mereka kita dapat lihat. Okay, in short, bagaimana Datuk Seri melihat benda-benda keutamaan dan bagaimana kita lihat bagaimana dalam Dewan ini menerima apa yang telah pun ditekankan oleh Datuk Seri sendiri. Inflasi dan inflasi makanan, keutamaan short term dihentak krisis.
Ya, apa dalam perbincangan tadi kita dapat lihat bahawa challenges ataupun cabaran-cabaran yang dihadapi oleh negara Eropah dan negara Asia adalah berlainan. Ya, ada short term risk mereka pun berlainan, risiko jangka panjang masa pun berlainan. Tetapi isu yang sama ialah isu inflasi. Isu inflasi di mana harga makanan seluruh dunia telah naik akibat kenaikan harga bahan mentah, kenaikan harga barang makanan, input pada barang makanan, terutamanya kerana harga mentah seperti minyak dan sebagainya. Dan di sini, alhamdulillah kita dapat lihat bahawa di rantau Asia Tenggara dan terutamanya di Malaysia, harga kadar inflasi masih lagi rendah, walaupun kadar inflasi makanan adalah lebih tinggi, tapi kalau kita berbanding dengan negara-negara Eropah dan terutamanya di negara-negara Afrika, kita masih lagi dalam keadaan yang alhamdulillah kita dapat mengawal kenaikan harga ini. Tetapi apa yang penting ialah semua negara bekerjasama dalam menghadapi cabaran ini. Kita tidak boleh bertindak sendiri dan the whole economy is all interconnected.
Okay, sebelum saya sentuh the road ahead, mungkin dah kita dapat sentuh ketika kita berbicara di Davos ini. Kita rentas benua sampai ke Jepun. PM ada menggariskan tentang dalam Nikkei Conference, PM Datuk Seri Ismail Sabri Yaakob cakap tentang kita mendefinisikan semula peranan Asia dalam rencam kepelbagaian dunia yang penuh dengan pendirian ini. So kita faham dia fragmented ataupun dia macam-macam jenis dipanggil berbelah pendirian ini. So PM menekankan tentang bagaimana integrasi serantau harus diperkukuh. Itu peranan Asia. Tapi kita juga faham ada jurang kerana dari aspek digital contohnya tak sama. Di rantau ASEAN sendiri pun kita lihat bagaimana jurang digital itu sangat melebar. Dan we need infra yang kuat. Sebelum kita bercakap tentang standard, dekat sini bercakap tentang digital standard, digital trade standard. Sebelum sampai di situ, penekanan harus diberikan kepada infrastruktur.
Ya. Kita dapat lihat semasa pandemik COVID-19 hit us ya, negara-negara setiap di dunia ini, negara-negara di Asia Tenggara sendiri menghadapi cabaran yang berlainan. Yeah. Digital salah satu yang saya katakan tadi. Ada lagi contoh-contoh yang lain di mana kita kadang-kadang membuat andaian bahawa isu ini hanya adalah isu yang tak terkesan kepada negara lain. Kerana mereka punya resources ataupun
infra yang sangat kuat.
Jadi sama juga dengan digital. Kerana semasa COVID-19, terutamanya semasa peak, negara-negara yang tidak mempunyai infrastruktur ini lebih terkesan berbanding dengan negara-negara yang ada. Jadi Malaysia alhamdulillah mempunyai infrastruktur yang berdapat mengurangkan beban rakyat dengan penggunaan digital. So, business could go on kan, SME, micro SME boleh masuk ke platform digital dan sebagainya.
Okay, the road ahead. Now, mengambil apa telah pun dibincangkan, kita pun faham intensiti di rantau Eropah lain, intensiti di rantau Asia ini berbeza. Tetapi untuk kita merapatkan jurang ni, and hala tuju masa depan.
Hala tuju masa depan, kita sebagai sebuah negara yang terbuka, ya, dagangan kepada PNK kita lebih 120%. Kita perlu bersama-sama dengan negara-negara jiran dan juga negara-negara rantau ini sama-sama bekerjasama untuk menghadapi cabaran masa depan kita sekarang, midterm dan juga long term.
Okay. Alright, terima kasih Datuk Seri. Kita akan buat satu wrap up interview untuk kita merumuskan apa yang perlu dilakukan menjelang perhimpunan WEF 2023 pula. Tetapi short term ini sebab kita faham apa yang berlaku terutamanya dalam kalangan kumpulan B40. Tekanan kos sara hidup ini adalah sesuatu yang sering ditekankan oleh Datuk Seri dalam semua sidang di WEF ini. Jadi kita akan sentuh mengenai ini dengan lebih lanjut. Inflasi lebih 4%, terutama inflasi makanan, bukan inflasi tapi inflasi makanan secara spesifik lebih 4%. Kita ada kebimbangan tentang sekiranya ada berlanjutan lebih 4-5 bulan, kumpulan P40 kita akan teruk. Jadi bagaimana kita nak lakukan itu, kita akan sentuh dalam wrap-up interview yang akan disiarkan pada Jumaat malam nanti. Untuk itu, Zulfitri, mungkin kita lihat konteks digital pula, sebab ada jurang digital yang sangat kuat. Thank you Datuk Seri. So Datuk Seri ada sesi lain pula dan saya pun nak kena pergi satu lagi sesi. Najib Arif boleh membuat satu connect balik dengan bagaimana digital standard yang diperlukan. Itu tetapi sebelum bercakap tentang standard, ketidaksamaan dari segi infrastruktur, even di rantau ASEAN sendiri bercakap tentang infrastruktur digital economy itu sendiri. Itu akan perlu dikupas dan perlu dihuraikan supaya micro SMEs di rantau kita ni dapat meniaga dengan lebih ramai. Sekarang ni kita ada 1.2 juta SME di Malaysia. Ini angel kita nak ramai lagi kalau boleh kita menjadi sebuah negara usahawan seperti mana dalam falsafah kita dalam Google Awani jiwa SME.
Okey, saya lepaskan Ashwat dahulu. Ashwat akan ada satu sesi interview dan juga rumusan kepada WEF yang berlangsung dan juga penamatnya tengah hari ini. Terima kasih Ashwat. Tapi saya tak lepaskan dulu Najib Arif. Najib, kalau dapat diceritakan juga kerana inilah yang dilihat dalam sesi Tengku Zafrul tadi di WEF, ada juga mengatakan bahawa kita bercerita mengenai inflasi tapi dalam masa yang sama kelebihan yang ada di Malaysia ialah kita memiliki komoditi yang harganya menaik sekarang ini, minyak contohnya, yang menjadi cushion kepada bagaimana kita mengawal subsidi kita pada hari ini. Adakah ini suatu perkara yang bagus, satu perkara dalam masa beberapa bulan ini, dan juga bagaimana kita melihat ini satu kelebihan tapi dalam masa sama perlu juga mencari sumber kekayaan yang lain contohnya?
Zul, kalau kita melihat betul, ini ya, Zul, kalau kita melihat kesan ini adalah negara, kita bersifatkan adalah tuah lah kepada kita kerana kita net exporter, pengekspor bersih dalam aspek komoditi sebagai contoh. Tetapi kalau kita melihat pada masa yang sama, nilai subsidi seperti yang Datuk Seri Tengku Zafrul sebutkan dalam sesi tersebut meningkat sehingga 70 bilion ringgit. Ini perlu diuruskan. Kita mungkin dapatkan Najib Arif sebentar lagi kerana ada sedikit gangguan di situ. Bagi anda yang baru mengikuti kami dari sejak 4.30 petang tadi, kami membawakan lintas langsung dari sesi World Economic Forum 2022 yang berlangsung di Davos, di mana antara sesi itu ialah menguruskan risiko di era tidak menentu pada ketika ini. Sesi yang disertai oleh Menteri Keuangan Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul itu antara lain menghimpunkan juga beberapa lagi nama-nama besar dalam di Blok Barat dan juga di dalam aspek hal ekonomi. Kita cuba untuk mendapatkan Najib Arif sebentar lagi, kalau dapat melalui Google Meet sebentar lagi. Dan dalam sesi itu juga antara lain yang diceritakan ialah topik mengenai perang dan juga konflik di antara Rusia dan juga Ukraine mendominasi diskusi sebentar tadi, di mana ia berkaitan rapat dengan harga minyak dan juga harga bekalan tenaga dan juga harga yang berkaitan dengan inflasi makanan. Najib, kalau dapat dapat bersambung ataupun bersiaran bersama kami semula, mungkin Najib dapat teruskan apabila kita mengatakan bahawa Malaysia menanggung subsidi yang cukup besar daripada 30 bilion hingga kepada 71 bilion tahun ini untuk menampung subsidi makanan itu contohnya. Tapi ada sedikit kelebihan apabila harga komoditi itu naik dijadikan sebagai cushion untuk menampung kerugian itu. Tapi adakah ini sustainable untuk jangka masa panjang, Najib? Najib mendengar? Okey, so saya minta maaf kerana ada masalah teknikal sedikit. Baik. Okey, Zul, kalau kita melihat bahawa betul ini adalah impak kepada Malaysia juga. Kita kalau melihat betul apa income yang kita dapat itu adalah boleh cushion sedikit, menampan sedikit segala kesan-kesan lain. Termasuk inflasi juga yang sepatutnya meningkat tinggi. Sekiranya kita tidak melaksanakan subsidi makanan dan sebagainya, kemungkinan inflasi makanan kita jauh lebih tinggi berbanding dengan negara lain. Kalau kita lihat di Eropah, inflasi makanan mereka 2 digit, 12, ada 20% dan sebagainya. Ini jauh lebih tinggi, jauh lebih mahal. Zul, saya berada di Davos. Kita tahu betapa mahalnya barangan di sini sebagai contoh. Bukan itu saja, ketika persiapan kita untuk datang ke sini pun, harga untuk sewa rumah sini pun dah makin mahal berbanding tahun-tahun lepas, Zul. Itu menunjukkan bahawa inflasi itu berlaku dalam setiap segmen ekonomi tersebut. Bagaimana untuk kita melihat lebihan ini? Tadi saya sebutkan lebihan pendapatan ini kita mahu salurkan ke tempat yang betul, kepada golongan yang betul, seperti B40, mungkin juga B50 sekarang ini. Bagaimana untuk kita melihat ini, mekanismenya ini? Itu yang kita ingin cuba tanyakan kepada Kementerian Kewangan, Tengku Zafrul sendiri. Bagaimana untuk kita laksanakan subsidi bersasar untuk minyak sebagai contoh? Ini penting kerana pada akhirnya perkiraan yang dibuat oleh MOF dalam RM1 subsidi, sebahagian besar 50 sen lebih adalah kepada golongan T20, 15 sen sahaja jatuh kepada B40. Ini adalah ketidakadilan sosial yang berlaku. Kita perlu atasi perkara ini, dan itu di peringkat Malaysia, dalam konteks Malaysia. Tapi inflasi ini adalah cabaran global. Semua negara pun berdepan dengan cabaran global seperti ini. Sebab itu pentingnya platform seperti WEF ini, kemasukan kita ke forum-forum ini untuk kita belajar negara lain atasi bagaimana, negara di Eropah bagaimana, negara di Asia pula bagaimana. Kemudian mungkin kita boleh cantumkan semua ini untuk membentuk strategi yang lebih baik untuk negara kita, dan pada masa yang sama kita juga melihat bahawa bagaimana untuk keampuhan jangka pendek, sederhana dan jangka panjang. Ini juga sesi yang disebut oleh Datuk Seri Tengku Zafrul semalam, iaitu melihat visi yang lebih jauh, langkah penyelesaian yang lebih jangka masa panjang. Pada masa yang sama, untuk penyelesaian jangka pendek, hasil jangka pendek masih lagi diteruskan, kerana ini penting untuk kemandirian. Kerana apabila berlaku peningkatan harga barang, ini memerlukan solusi jangka pendek segera. Kita tidak boleh ada jangka panjang untuk menyelesaikan isu harga ayam yang mahal sebagai contoh. Ini semua akan diselesaikan dengan strategi yang betul, dan amalan terbaik negara lain juga akan dibawa. Saya percaya juga akan dimasukkan dalam strategi kita. Itu juga persoalan yang kita tinggalkan kepada Tengku Zafrul dan juga mungkin kerajaan Malaysia juga, Zul.
Saya ingin berbual panjang bersama dengan Najib, tapi saya rasa Najib juga ada tugasan di sana, dan juga beliau akan berbincang langsung insya-Allah dalam Awani 7.45 nanti, dan juga tempoh WEF daripada 22 hari bulan sampai 26 hari bulan ini akan Najib packagekan dan juga bawakan kepada anda. Kerana akhirnya nanti, ini mungkin ada yang kata perbincangan elitis, tapi akhirnya ianya berkaitan dengan kita. Kita bercerita mengenai harga ayam, kita bercerita mengenai inflasi makanan, ianya bersangkut paut antara satu sama lain. Jadi itu kami akan bawakan dalam platform kami yang seterusnya di sisi WEF 2022. Terima kasih Najib Arif, terima kasih Astro Ismail yang bersama dengan kami sebentar tadi. Terima kasih kepada anda. 12.30 hari di Davos, 6 petang di Malaysia. Teruskan bersama kami di astroawani.com untuk perkembangan yang lebih menyeluruh mengenai WEF 2022. Kami berhenti dahulu di sini. Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera.
Aidilfitri ini, kesihatan sekeluarga perlu diutamakan. Sebab itulah saya mengamalkan pengambilan C Beyond Vitamin C yang berpisah oil segar. Ia memberikan